The phone receiver in Marilyn Monroe's hand felt like a block of ice as a studio executive. His voice, booming with the fury of a man about to lose millions, delivered his final, desperate threat. If she stepped foot in the Korean cold, she would be permanently severed from Hollywood, and her career would be over. She chose the freezing, desolate landscape anyway, but nothing could prepare her for the moment her glamorous dress snagged on the ramp, foreshadowing the physical price she was about to pay to matter. It was February of 1954. The breakup with Joe DiMaggio was still a raw wound, a headline spat across every newspaper, and the relentless pressure of being Marilyn Monroe, the perpetual blonde joke, was crushing her spirit. Every compliment felt conditional, every role felt predictable, and the quiet loneliness of her life was louder than the roaring applause of any premiere. She desperately needed to step out of the glossy, fabricated image and feel something real, something that wasn't filtered through a lens or a lawyer. The invitation had come casually, almost as an afterthought. Would she consider a United Service Organizations tour to visit the troops stationed on the Korean peninsula? Her management immediately scoffed. Too cold, too dangerous, no money in it. But Marilyn heard something different. She heard a call for help from men who had been forgotten, frozen thousands of miles from the comfort she had come to despise. She imagined those young faces trapped in the unforgiving landscape and realized they were just as isolated as she was. She stood in her dressing room, staring at the endless rows of high-fashion gowns and luxurious furs. The trip to Korea was a chance to reclaim the woman beneath the shimmer, the girl named Norma Jean who understood what it meant to be unseen. The executive, still shouting about breach of contract and financial ruin, didn't understand. He only saw dollar signs. She saw a moral obligation. Marilyn's reply wasn't a negotiation. It was a quiet declaration. She told the producer that she wasn't asking for permission, and she didn't care about the consequences. The moment she hung up, she walked over to her closet and bypassed the gowns, pulling out instead the warmest coat she owned. She walked away from the warmth, the safety, and the $700,000 payday awaiting her next picture, all for the sake of a handshake and a song for men who needed it more than Hollywood needed her. As she left, she deliberately placed a heavy diamond and pearl necklace, a gift from the studio, on her dressing table, letting the light catch it as a final symbol of the gilded prison she was abandoning. The last words she heard crackling through the telephone line, paraphrasing the executive's rage, were a clear warning. Marilyn Monroe has permanently severed ties with the studio and may never film again. The moment the military transport plane landed, the door hissing open on the isolated runway, the cold didn't just meet Marilyn, it attacked her. A physical fist that slammed the air out of her lungs. It was an impossible, biting chill, sharper than any winter she had ever known. This was the Korea of 1954. Her security detail rushed to hustle her into a nearby Quonset hut, desperate to shield the most famous woman in the world from the unforgiving elements. But Marilyn paused on the tarmac, transfixed, looking out at the endless, desolate landscape, a gray-brown expanse of frozen earth. It was a bleak majesty, utterly hostile to comfort. As she paused, the military field doctor, a man whose face was etched with fatigue, hurried past her, giving her handlers a desperate look. "This cold isn't normal, Miss Monroe," he muttered, pulling his collar higher. "If she gets ill, it's not a common cold. It's a field evacuation risk." This externalized the severity of the threat immediately. Then she saw them. Not the generals, but the soldiers. Young men who looked barely old enough to shave, standing rigidly in their heavy, drab uniforms. Their faces were chapped, their eyes holding a look of weary endurance that broke Marilyn's heart on sight. These weren't heroes from the newsreels, they were just boys, breathing air that felt like broken glass. She wore a tightly tailored wool suit. Next to the soldiers in their bulky, field-worn gear, she felt impossibly fragile, like a porcelain doll misplaced in a battlefield. Her usual sense of glamorous command evaporated. She suddenly felt inadequate, her star power meaningless against the stark reality of their sacrifice. For the first time, the spotlight felt wrong. It felt like a mocking contrast to their silent suffering. As she moved past the rows of troops, one young man offered a hesitant salute, his hand shaking so violently it was a wonder he could hold the position. She stopped and met his eyes. They were the tired, grateful eyes of someone who hadn't seen a reminder of home in a lifetime. In that brief exchange, something profound shifted inside her. She realized these men didn't need the joke. They didn't need the pinup. They needed proof that the world they were fighting for still remembered them. The moment was fleeting, interrupted by a producer named Gil who grabbed her elbow, his face pale with concern. Marilyn, please. Inside. The wind chill is 20 degrees below zero. We cannot risk you getting ill. But she pulled her elbow back gently. She had chosen this cold, and now she would share it. As she was ushered toward the makeshift stage, the thin fabric of her dress caught sharply on the metal doorframe, ripping a jagged seam near her hem. It was the first of many physical injuries she would sustain, a jarring symbol of the vulnerability she faced, but chose to ignore. The applause that met Marilyn Monroe when she stepped onto the makeshift stage was a physical explosion, a desperate release of emotion from thousands of freezing, exhausted men. But as the blinding, weak spotlights hit her, she saw the reality. 3 flimsy wooden pallets, camouflage netting, and a microphone stand that rattled violently. This was a makeshift theater of war. The atmosphere was electric but precarious. Thousands of young soldiers clustered together were stomping their heavy boots to keep the blood flowing. Marilyn wore a glittering, flesh-colored gown that offered absolutely zero protection against the bitter Korean wind, which sliced through the thin fabric like 1,000 tiny razors. She raised the microphone, and the thin sound system immediately crackled and squealed. She tried to deliver her opening line, but the wind snatched the words right out of her mouth. It was a humiliating moment, a reminder that her fame was powerless against the merciless elements. She felt exposed, truly vulnerable. She started her first song. Her fingers, already numb, struggled to grasp the microphone, and she could feel her lips resisting the effort to form her famous smile. She was fighting a two-front battle, maintaining the illusion of glamour while battling the physical cold. The chill was tightening her chest, making every breath a conscious, painful effort. From the side of the stage, her producer, Gil, was giving frantic, nonverbal cues. Speed it up, move faster. Marilyn looked only at the faces in the crowd. She focused on Private Miller, whose expression was a quiet, frozen exhaustion. She realized her challenge was proving that the warmth and life she represented was stronger than the cold they all shared. She pushed her voice louder, ignored the ache in her lungs, and danced with a desperate intensity she had never needed on a warm, well-lit soundstage. She felt the wind tear at her hair, but she pushed on, determined to conquer the physical agony. Marilyn finished her first number, gasping slightly for breath. As she scanned the thousands of faces, she noticed Private Miller slowly lowering his head, not from boredom, but from sheer exhausted inability to stay alert. It was a silent, heartbreaking acknowledgement of the war's true toll, and it was about to change the entire direction of her show. Marilyn had just thrown her head back for her famous, unrestrained laugh, but her eyes caught sight of the young soldier in the third row, Private Miller, and the sound of her own laughter suddenly seemed hollow, even cruel. His face was a study in exhausted, profound emptiness. This was the emotional turning point that instantly dismantled the wall Marilyn had built. She stopped mid-pose, the famous smile fading. Private Miller was barely moving. Ice clung to the stubble on his chin and the fabric of his collar, hammering home the brutal reality of his existence. He wasn't watching a star, he was struggling to stay present. The crisis arrived instantly. Private Miller suddenly lurched forward, swaying violently before 2 nearby comrades caught him. This visible medical crisis was the immediate external reason Marilyn's performance shattered. Her entire script vanished from her mind. This young man was a silent, powerful monument to sacrifice. She realized she was performing against the insidious grip of misery and fatigue. The sheer guilt hit her like a physical shock. She tasted the deep inadequacy of her shimmering gown. She was a temporary distraction, a fleeting ghost of the world they were losing to protect. What good was a glamorous song to a man whose only current desire was safe sleep? Her energy became infused with a sudden, aching pity. She walked slowly to the edge of the wooden stage closest to him. She began to sing, but her voice was softer, directed, almost pleading toward Private Miller. She only sought to acknowledge the pain she saw. She held the microphone down low. She continued to sing, but her focus was pouring a raw current of sympathy toward the soldier. He finally blinked, and his eyes dropped to meet hers for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting glance, she saw a depth of weariness that transcended the cold. It was the moment the glamour died and humanity took over. The most devastating part was what she then noticed. No one around Miller moved to assist him. They were either too cold, too exhausted, or too accustomed to distress to react, confirming that her intervention was necessary. The silence after the applause felt heavier than the cold. Marilyn started to introduce her next song, but the words caught in her throat, constricted by the relentless, pervasive ache seizing her body. She was only 20 minutes into her set, and every nerve ending was screaming at her to retreat. Her shimmering gown was a cruel joke, a thin layer of illusion against the absolute zero of the elements. She could no longer feel the tips of her toes. Her fingers were just numb, useless extensions. For a flashing moment, she entertained the thought of abandoning the stage. Gil was still frantic, his hand motions getting larger and more desperate. But then she looked back at Private Miller, and the internal debate vanished. Simultaneously, she saw the commanding officer approach Gil off stage and clearly signal a maximum time limit, indicating that critical conditions would soon force them to abort. Marilyn, seeing this visible clock, knew she was racing against an impossible deadline. She realized her 20 minutes of suffering was an eternity to these young men. The pain in her body transformed from a reason to stop into a fuel for defiance. She began to sing, but her performance was no longer theatrical. She began to dance harder, deliberately forcing blood into her frozen limbs, turning the movement into a battle against the encroaching numbness. She could hear her voice falter, but she refused to let the sound system crackle again. She focused all her energy on holding their gaze. It was an unspoken contract. If you can stay, I can stay. The sheer, brute endurance of the soldiers forced her to look past her own fleeting physical misery. She finished the song, her breath coming in ragged puffs, knowing that the physical danger was increasing with every minute she stayed exposed. As she caught her breath, she saw Gil in the wings violently grab the radio from the comms tech, threatening to call the general over her head. Marilyn knew her producer was losing control, raising the stakes not just of her health, but of the entire military operation. The air crackled with the unspoken tension between the stage and the wings. Marilyn finished her song and saw Gil make a sudden, purposeful move. He was walking onto the stage to extract her. The thousands of men in uniform immediately went silent, sensing the power struggle. Gil reached her side, his face rigid with fury. He leaned in close. Marilyn, stop this now. The wind chill has dropped to 40 below zero. They've already called medics. You are an asset. We need to get you inside. His hand clamped onto her elbow, trying to physically turn her toward the exit. It was a moment of profound confrontation. Professional obligation versus moral conscience. Look at them, Gil, she whispered back, her voice raspy. They can't leave. If I leave now, I'm just another celebrity who ran when it got inconvenient. Gil's eyes darted nervously. You don't understand the danger, Marilyn. I swear, I will immediately cut the power to the lights and sound right now. This risks causing panic among the men. Your choice could jeopardize the entire event. Marilyn took a deep, shuddering breath of the icy air. She looked one last time at Gil, her expression a mix of finality and pity. Crucially, standing just behind Gil, the commanding officer was visible, his expression stone cold, confirming the evacuation order was now military policy. Marilyn wasn't yielding. She raised the microphone again, silencing the producer and signaling with that single, resolute gesture that the show was not over. With her head held high, she stepped away from Gil's reach toward the very edge of the stage. The producer watched in impotent horror. Marilyn was now exposed, defiant, and ready to deliver the 4 simple words that would shatter her career contract and solidify her legend forever. With one deliberate step, Marilyn Monroe moved beyond the desperate whispered warnings and reclaimed the stage, the microphone cord tightening in her gloved hand. The entire atmosphere seemed to focus entirely on the single, defiant act of a woman choosing her conscience. She looked directly at the thousands of expectant, cold faces. She raised the microphone, not to sing, but to speak. Her voice, rough and tight from the frigid air, carried an unmistakable tone of deep conviction. She spoke the words slowly. She looked specifically toward Private Miller in the 3rd row, who was watching her with sudden, intense focus. I'm staying with you. 4 simple words. Not a movie quote. Just a raw, unscripted declaration of solidarity. The simplicity of the statement was devastatingly powerful. It was the ultimate defiant refusal of the luxury she could have demanded. The air around Gil seemed to vibrate with his silent, furious protests. The reaction from the audience was not immediate. There was a pause, a long, agonizing beat of disbelief, then the explosion. It was a roar, a guttural, emotional outpouring of relief and grateful acknowledgement that swallowed the sound of the wind. They stamped their boots harder, celebrating her choice. Marilyn stood there, letting the wave of emotion wash over her, knowing that her simple refusal to retreat had just cost her dearly in California, but had gained her everything here in Korea. Her voice, raw and tight, crackled slightly on the final word, confirming the physical cost, but making the sincerity irrefutable. The sound that followed her 4 words was the roar of the frozen crowd, a physical wave of shared relief and profound gratitude. Marilyn knew this was the truest standing ovation she would ever receive, born of human solidarity. She didn't hesitate. She launched into her next song, but the performance was fundamentally changed. The flirty showmanship was gone, replaced by a raw, visceral intensity. She danced with an almost frantic determination, turning her physical discomfort into a visible act of courage. The soldiers settled into an almost reverent stillness. They were witnessing a shared battle against the cold and despair. Marilyn began making direct eye contact, delivering a single line of the song as if it were a private assurance of her presence. The remaining 25 minutes of the show stretched into an eternity, yet the time was filled with a buoyant energy. The soldiers no longer looked defeated. Their faces now held a flicker of fire, a spirit reawakened by her commitment. The shared atmosphere created a psychological warmth that defied the thermometer. Marilyn finished her final, exhausted curtsy. The applause was deafening. The most important consequence wasn't the noise, it was the look on Private Miller's face. He wasn't just awake, he was smiling. As their eyes met, Private Miller offered a small, sincere, formal salute, a profound gesture of respect. The show was finally over. The cold, now unchecked by adrenaline, rushed back into her body, and she realized the true, private cost of her heroic refusal was only just beginning to manifest. The applause was still ringing in her ears, but the second Marilyn stepped off the stage, the sound was replaced by the shocking chaos of the backstage area. Medics rushed toward her. Her body instantly surrendered to the cold. She began to shake violently. Her lips were an alarming shade of blue, and her skin was icy to the touch. The medics immediately swaddled her in heavy military blankets. Her glamour had been paid for in physical agony. Gil stood several paces away, rigid with fury. But before the medics could fully whisk her away, a commanding officer pushed past Gil and knelt beside Marilyn. "Miss Monroe," his voice was thick with emotion, "you saved lives out there. You gave those boys dignity when they were ready to break. That was more than a show. That was a miracle." His words were the only antidote she needed for Gil's silent condemnation. Marilyn tried to thank him, but her voice was gone. She managed only a weak nod. The medics gently moved her to the heated tent. Her condition was stabilized quickly, but the doctors gave a stern, somber warning. The exposure was severe, and they feared lasting repercussions on her respiratory health. This was not a stunt. This was a reckless act of bravery. Gil finally stormed into the medical tent, pacing with frustrated aggression. "You had a moral obligation to your contract, Marilyn," he hissed. "You don't understand the headlines we're managing right now. We were ready to get you on a private jet hours ago." Marilyn, too weak to speak, simply looked at the producer, then raised her aching hand and pointed silently toward a window where a small group of soldiers stood guard, their expressions filled with quiet reverence. Gil saw the truth in their eyes. Her moral obligation was now irrevocably tied to them, not to the contracts. He left the tent, defeated and ashamed. The military staff, understanding the depth of the conflict, moved the entire operation swiftly and silently, ensuring Marilyn's recovery remained their top priority, quietly shielding her from any further Hollywood interference. The commanding officer, before he left, leaned down and pressed something small and metallic into her hand, a tarnished unit badge worn smooth by years of service. "This is for the woman, Miss Monroe," he whispered, "not the star." It was a gesture of profound, silent thanks that transcended the cheers and the tears. Marilyn immediately recognized it as a symbol of the 7th Infantry Division, a unit with a reputation for impossible endurance. She vowed to herself, in that moment, that she would carry this simple, tarnished medal under every costume, a private, defiant armor against Hollywood's superficial demands. As the immediate danger subsided, the medics tended to her small, persistent injuries. The tear in her dress was patched by a young nurse with military-grade thread, an impossible repair on the flimsy fabric, but done with profound care. Marilyn later reflected that the simple, rough stitches were stronger and more honest than any designer seam. They were a scar marking her victory. Before she was airlifted out, the military chaplain visited her tent. He spoke to her not of her fame, but of her service. He recounted how many men had been on the brink of despair that night, saved not by military might, but by a flicker of blonde hair and 4 simple words. The chapel had heard more fervent prayers of thanks for her presence than for the arrival of fresh supplies. Marilyn realized she had given them the one thing they truly lacked, a reason to believe in the world they were freezing to protect. This understanding that her presence was a spiritual necessity cemented her own internal transformation. Marilyn spent the next 72 hours recovering under strict medical supervision. During this time, the true moral accounting of her choice settled over her. She realized the cold had done what Hollywood could not. It had stripped away the artifice, leaving only the essential, vulnerable core of Norma Jean. She was forced to confront the difference between being loved by millions and being valued by a few. The cheers of those soldiers, earned through shared physical agony, outweighed every glamorous premiere she had ever endured. Her voice, though temporarily compromised, had bought something far more durable than ticket sales. She felt a connection to humanity she had spent her whole life searching for in transient relationships and applause. It was a raw, undeniable redemption that she would guard fiercely. Over the next few days, as Marilyn began her slow recovery in Tokyo, the true ripple effect of her 4 words surfaced. Small, hand-carved tokens and meticulously folded letters began arriving. They were personal declarations of gratitude, signed with names and ranks from every frozen position. One soldier sent a miniature, crudely carved wooden heart. Another, a scrap of paper that simply read, "Thank you for seeing us." The messages spoke of renewed hope and a willingness to fight. They felt less alone, less forgotten. They had received proof that America's warmth extended even to the darkest, coldest corners. Marilyn spent hours reading these notes, carefully unfolding the damp, brittle paper. She realized that the cheers of those soldiers had been the first truly honest applause she had ever received, untainted by Hollywood's hunger or expectation. She stored these treasures carefully, knowing that the most important reviews of her life would never appear in Variety or The Hollywood Reporter. The experience instilled in her a new quiet resolve, a profound psychological shield against the inevitable public and professional criticisms that awaited her return. She had faced true danger and chosen human connection. Nothing Hollywood could threaten her with would ever compare. The message that truly broke her was a package containing a small, smooth, ordinary stone. The note was from Private Miller. It contained only 3 words: "We made it." The sheer joy of that victory, paid for with her own physical suffering, was overwhelming. The stone was the most precious gift Marilyn had ever received, a tangible symbol that her physical sacrifice had translated into the spiritual preservation of a young man. She realized the minor frostbite on her fingers was a small price for the spiritual healing she had given him. The price she paid was high, but the lasting impact was a reward beyond measure. She would later donate a significant sum, quietly and anonymously, to the USO, demanding that better heating be provided for every future performer's venue in cold climates, ensuring no one else had to pay the same physical cost. The act was a silent, lasting defiance of the studio heads who measured her in fractions of a dollar. She measured her contribution in human resilience. Marilyn's departure from the Korean peninsula was quiet, shielded entirely by the military. There were no press conferences, no stage farewells, only the deep, unspoken respect of the men who had witnessed her choice. She carried with her not a contract, but a philosophy forged in the bitter cold. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the pathway to true strength and meaningful connection. This intellectual realization dramatically altered her perspective on her own art. She began demanding roles that reflected this new emotional depth, fighting against the shallow, two-dimensional characters she was expected to play. Her later work, the dramatic roles, the push for artistic control, was all traced back to that frozen stage. Korea had not just been a tour. It had been her emotional and artistic crucible. She understood that the greatest performance was always the most authentic one. This quest for authenticity, for the real Norma Jean beneath the glamour, became the central, often tragic, driving force of her remaining years. The memory of the soldier's shivering salute was a constant reminder that her life had a higher, less marketable purpose than celebrity. Decades later, at a Veterans of Foreign Wars reunion, Private Miller, now a respected grandfather, told a reporter about his most meaningful memory. He spoke not of battles, but of a woman standing alone against the bitter wind. He pulled out the small, smooth stone from his pocket, explaining it was a reminder that vulnerability could sometimes be the truest form of strength. The stone represented the cold they shared and her refusal the warmth they gained. He detailed how, years later, he had recovered from a severe psychological crisis during his later service by simply remembering her face and her words. "I'm staying with you. became his internal mantra when all hope was lost. When he finally left the service, he named his only daughter Norma Jean, a quiet tribute to the woman behind the legend, ensuring the secret name of her humanity lived on. The story of Private Miller's return to health became a private legend within his veteran community. He wasn't just healed, he was reborn through the gratitude he carried. He often told his grandchildren that Miss Monroe didn't bring hope to Korea. She drew hope from it, proving to herself and the world that her spirit was stronger than her shell. He became a living testament to the fact that celebrity, when wielded with genuine compassion, could be a life-saving force. This one night was his anchor, the definitive proof that he, Private Miller, mattered to the world. But the most remarkable part of the story, the part Miller only shared in hushed, intimate tones, was the lifelong spiritual debt he felt. He had often wondered what happened to the famous actress. He began a small, anonymous foundation in his community that focused on providing comfort packages to soldiers deployed in hostile, cold environments, always including a simple card that read, "Someone stayed for me, stay for them." He built a successful life rooted entirely in that single, profound moment of celebrity compassion. Every time a package went out, it was Private Miller repaying a favor, ensuring Marilyn's choice had an infinite ripple effect. The legacy of that single show was not confined to a foreign battlefield. It followed Marilyn back across the ocean. The producers, seeing the overwhelming positive public reaction and the massive media attention on her courage and dedication, realized they could not sustain the threats. They were forced to renegotiate her contract not on their terms, but on hers. They had tried to break her by threatening her career, but her moral integrity had made her untouchable. She returned to Hollywood, still the star, but now she carried an unshakable inner confidence, a direct knowledge of her own worth that the studio system could no longer erode. She was no longer just the blonde ingenue, she was the woman who risked everything for the invisible men. This profound shift from commodity to champion was the most enduring change in her life. Marilyn Monroe returned to Hollywood and immediately faced backlash. But for the rest of her life, she would touch the velvet box where she kept that stone and the unit badge, reminders of the time her life had truly mattered. The memory of Private Miller's fragile smile was her secret shield against the superficial cruelty of her industry. She had gone to Korea seeking an escape, but she left with a profound truth. The greatest applause is for the person who chooses to stay when others would run. Her simple, powerful refusal, "I'm staying with you," became a mantra. This moment defined a deep moral code that transcended her public persona. This moment in Korea defined Marilyn's deepest desire to be seen as a deeply feeling woman. She taught the world that a choice made from the heart will always eclipse a decision made from the wallet. The same studio executives who threatened her career were ultimately forced to feature her Korea tour in promotional material. Her defiance had become her most valuable asset, proving that authenticity always defeats calculation. She gave over 100,000 troops a moment of profound shared humanity, but more importantly, she rescued her own spirit. She realized the constant fear she carried, the fear of not being good enough, of being unseen, was less terrifying than the cold she had just conquered for them. The physical discomfort faded, but the moral clarity she gained on that frigid stage remained, a quiet, insistent voice that guided her through the subsequent chaos of her legendary life. It was the only time she ever felt completely free from the constraints of the platinum blonde image. Her actions proved that true glamour resided not in the dress, but in the willingness to suffer for empathy. The true legacy of Marilyn Monroe is the story of the day she refused to yield to the cold, using her own fragility to ignite a flame of unforgettable hope in the hearts of thousands of heroes. She walked onto that stage as a celebrity, seeking validation, and walked off having achieved something infinitely more profound, lasting human connection. If this story of Marilyn's sacrifice and courage touched your heart, hit that subscribe button to ensure you never miss a moment of Hollywood's most profound human secrets. Give this video a like if you believe that character is always more important than celebrity.